Good evening, everyone. We have a few housekeeping rules we'd like to share to ensure that tonight's meeting is a successful one. During this meeting, we will provide information that is specific to and focuses on ATL Zoning 2.0 and the process. We have set aside opportunities for participants to ask questions to our speakers following each presentation. During the Q&A session, please ask one question at a time to allow all questions to be recognized and answered. As you'll notice, everyone is muted. Please use the raise your hand icon in the lower toolbar to request to be unmuted for your question. Speakers will be called in the order in which the hand raised icons are lifted. If you are joining the meeting via telephone, please press *9 to raise your hand and *6 to unmute when your phone number is called. You may also post questions in the chat as we will be answering questions from that feature. Additionally, if you are watching live via YouTube, please post your questions in the YouTube chat. If you're watching the Idea Labs at a viewing party, please share your questions with the facilitator. We will make every effort to answer unanswered general questions asked tonight on the project website's Frequently Asked Questions page. Thank you.
Great. All right, Kieta, would you like to give some opening remarks? Or maybe. All righty, well, Kieta raised her hand. Sorry, I think we're having technical difficulties. Here we go. All righty, well.
Thank you, I was muted. Good evening, everyone. My name is Kieta Holmes. I'm the Director of the Office of Zoning and Development, and I'd like to welcome you to the second Idea Lab. Tonight, we'll be discussing two topics of very important interest to the City of Atlanta. One, how we will code after COVID-19, and two, sustainability. Tonight will be chock full of information. Please sit back and listen and ask plenty of questions. Again, welcome. Go ahead, Caleb.
Great. Let me share my screen very briefly. Good evening, everyone. I hope everyone's had a great week. As you may recall from the previous Idea Labs, my name is Caleb Rossico. I'm the project manager for the Zoning Ordinance Rewrite Consulting Team. And I would like to echo Director Holmes' welcome to you this evening. Tonight's Idea Lab is going to be a little different from our previous one, which was focused very heavily on understanding the Atlanta patterns. Today, what we wanted to do, as Director Holmes mentioned, was talk about what are two very sort of current issues facing the city of Atlanta and really many American cities. The issues of thinking about how do we learn from the COVID-19 pandemic, and then topics of sustainability. But before we do that, I did want to remind everyone that this video this evening is being recorded, and like all of our Idea Labs, will be posted to the project website, which is www.atlzoning.com. Additionally, as a reminder for folks who may be new, we have set up a hotline. So if anyone has any questions or comments about this video or anything related to the zoning ordinance rewrite, please feel free to leave us a message at 404-546-0116. And then finally, we have also set up a project email, and we've actually received several emails since last week and have responded to them. That address is atlzoning2@atlantaga.gov. And all of those emails go to both myself and Director Holmes, and between the two of us, we'll answer as quickly as possible. And then finally, I did want to remind everyone that the videos are being streamed this evening on YouTube under Atlanta Department of City Planning. And so I'd like to welcome those of you who are not in the Zoom meeting, but are at the YouTube viewing party. Now, with that said, because we do have so many folks here tonight at the viewing parties, we're going to be doing things a little different regarding polling. As you may remember from the previous session, if you attended, throughout the course of the process, we'd like to hear from you, the stakeholders of the city, and begin to respond to some of the content. And so for those of you who are joining us by Zoom, it's going to be no different from last week. There will be a sort of poll that pops up. you'll be able to click on the answer and you'll be able to respond that way. But for those of you who may be watching on YouTube, or for those of you who may be joining us at one of the viewing parties, we also wanted to give you an opportunity to participate. And so what we've done is we've set up a feature where you can use your smartphone to actually participate in the polls as well. And I'll read the results as we go through the evening. So for those of you who are at a viewing party or watching on YouTube, to access this feature, use your smartphone to go to menti.com. That's MENTI.com. And then once you're there, there's going to be a question where it asks you for a code. And the code for this particular Idea Lab is 8291-8920. So again, go to menti.com, MENTI.com, enter the passcode 8291-8920, and you'll be able to participate in the surveys this evening. And it looks like we have at least 20, 25 folks watching us from offsite, so welcome. So with that said, the first thing we wanted to do this evening is begin to understand how effective our outreach is working. And so the first thing that we would like to do, both to test out the Menti function for those of you who are joining us at a viewing party, but also for those of you on Zoom, we'd like you to tell us how you learned about the meeting tonight. So Yinka, if you can put that question up. And for those of you on Menti, there should be an opportunity for you to also learn that. So the options are e-blast, social media, postcard, yard sign, press release, or other. So again, just go to menti.com if you're at an Idea Lab, MENTI.com, enter the code 8291-8920 and answer there. And so we'll give this a couple more seconds. It looks like among those of you who are here, social media and e-blast have been extremely effective. We have several others, which I'm curious about that. Perhaps the media, perhaps some of the articles that have been done. And for those of you who are here, who are joining us on the viewing stations, most of you actually have heard through word of mouth or others. So I think this is great. Good. So I'm happy to see that it works. So please, if you are in a menti.com on your phone, do not log out. Stay there, and we'll proceed for the evening. And then for those of you who are joining us via Zoom, it'll be no different than before. So the first thing we're going to learn about tonight is a presentation from Susan Henderson at Placemakers, where we learn a little bit about what is going on nationally regarding COVID-19. For those of you who don't know Susan, Susan is one of the sort of nation's preeminent thinkers in city planning and city building, and really creating cities that are lovable, high quality of life places to live, work, and play. And so Susan and her team have put together a brief video that talks a little bit about some of the things that American cities are doing in response to COVID. So I'll turn it over, and we'll watch that for about 20, 25 minutes. So Inka? Okay.
Hello, my name is Susan Henderson with Placemakers, and in this Idea Lab, we'll be talking about coding after COVID. The reason we were asked to give this session is because our firm has been tracking the results at an urban planning level of interventions cities have taken to survive the pandemic, both economically and in the case of public health. And hello, my name is Susan Henderson with Placemakers, and in this Idea Lab, we'll be talking about coding after COVID. The reason we were asked to give this session is because our firm has been tracking the results at an urban planning level of interventions cities have taken to survive the pandemic, both economically and in the case of public health. And we've compiled the pandemic toolkit. This is a website, the link is at the bottom of the screen, and you can go through the individual tools that we determined to be the most successful and how to implement them at the local level. And then this shows you the database that Hazel Boris, one of our partners, she's continuing to curate this, and it's open source. So many people have contributed to it, but it indicates what the intervention was, where it is, a general description of it, and links if available. And then in each situation, it talks about whether it is during lockdown, post-vaccine, or ongoing post-pandemic. And so most of the tools that we'll be discussing today are in the ongoing section because there are things that we've learned through this process that cities and towns can take forward into a more resilient future. The reason we're doing this is for future resilience. We don't know what the next issue will be, and it's not just for the emergency needs of how we live in our cities, but it's also for just more robust economies and better public health. So you'll see through this process, we divide all of these issues into SMLXL. And that's sort of shorthand for whether it's easy to do or it's challenging to do, and sort of that declension between the two. We found that assessing local capacity is really crucial to any sort of zoning or public policy intervention, because you have to look at what your staff can accomplish. Is it challenging to administer? How difficult is it to get it ramped up? And probably one of the most important things is how much interdepartmental coordination is needed, because we'll talk about a number of issues today that really are solely in the purview of traffic engineering and public works. But the Department of City Planning has a whole lot to do with that, because they're looking holistically at the fabric of the city. And so those sorts of partnerships are crucial to success. And then also the other barrier or capacity issue that you have to consider is public perception. So many of these are embraced warmly by the public. Others are with more caution, and then some are absolute, even though they're very good practices, the public is quite fearful of them. And then what will happen is whatever the public reaction is, obviously will impact the responses of Planning Commission and City Council, because for City Council in particular, that's their constituency and they have to be responsive. So as you begin to consider which of these to utilize, obviously the easiest ones are best done first. So the overarching lessons learned from the pandemic is that streets and sidewalks really should be shared space, not just for cars and pedestrians, but for scooters and cyclists and wheelchairs and dining and retail. And all of these can cohabitate very peacefully within the public right-of-way if it's planned for appropriately. And the parks should be available for public and private space. And by private, I really mean commercial. So in the same way that the streets have evolved into being more diverse in their uses, the parks have really come to serve a broader use than just recreation, passive and active, in that many cities have found that integrating food trucks, even pop-up retail, and other small-scale commercial activities not only further activates the park, but it enables these small businesses to remain viable during a very difficult time. And that segues into that local economy really should be supported at the smallest scale. So microeconomy, and what can we do? And this is where zoning, because it directly impacts use, has the greatest responsibility. And frankly, over the last decades, has created the greatest burden. The City of Atlanta Department of City Planning has developed this wonderful tool called the Tactical Urbanism Guide. And we found it quite interesting that it was published in September of last year, 2020, which would imply that it was influenced by the pandemic. But regardless, it probably was a work that was long in progress, because tactical urbanism has become a very effective tool to test out interventions before they become public. And we like to say that you need to expedite the desirable, and that's what tactical urbanism is all about. It's about empowering things to happen at the scale of the neighborhood and even at the scale of the block, so that it can be owned by the community. And this is a fabulous guide that talks about context, where it's possible, what you can do, what the general criteria are, and then how to go about it. And the Department of City Planning provided these wonderful images of some of the projects that have come out of this. So y'all are already doing the things that we'll talk about today, like the pop-up bike lanes and the parklets and activating the public spaces. And so this is something that's not new to the City of Atlanta. We'll just be talking today about ways to expedite that process. We'll begin with the largest parcel, and that is the right-of-way, the streets and sidewalks, and what all can happen within that realm. And we'll begin with a fabulous video that I really love of an open street in New York City in Queens, 34th Avenue. And we'll take a moment and watch that video.
So hi, I'm State Senator Jessica Ramos, and I am sitting in the middle of 34th Avenue. Who would have thunk it?
The minute you put up the first gate, people step into the street, and it's like, it's sort of like a symphony.
You can just see the smiles on people's faces, the children running around, bike riders. It's really a nice thing for our community.
I walk this street every morning and sometimes in the evening, and I always see my friends. It's such a great way to reconnect, especially when a lot of us spend so much time indoors right now and we really feel isolated.
This is like a reunion spot for kids to, from a distance, be able to see each other and ride their bikes together.
People just want a little bit of fresh air, a chance to stretch their legs. People have come around to the idea that, yes, we do need this at a minimum for mental health.
We come out here almost every day. We come out to see the dogs and the people, and I get to run into people I didn't even know lived in our neighborhood.
I love 34th Avenue. It's beautiful. The people enjoy the street, a lot of people.
We have all this area totally monitored by volunteers, not police officers, not DOT people, just local volunteers, which makes it so special.
This is just the beginning of so much more we can do. The beginning of whether we can transform the way that we think about the relationship between us, our streets, and who the streets are for in our city.
I love this video because it shows us so clearly what can be achieved by reclaiming the streets for people on feet and wheels and scooters and wheelchairs and virtually every available form of transportation. So the very first thing we'll talk about today is enabling outdoor dining. The following slides that you see in this format are all directly from the pandemic toolkit. And then in the upper right-hand corner, you'll see the indication of whether the capacity is small or large. And this one is one of the easiest to do because most cities have done it already to some extent. And so it begins with what it is, how you implement it, a brief description, and then what interventions are required. And so the biggest issue associated with sidewalk dining has been the permitting process. Is it even possible? In some places it's not. So making it legal and then expediting the permitting and hopefully reducing, if not eliminating, the fee structure. And at the very bottom of the screen, the black boxes will be links to great examples that we think could be useful. This one is for the city of Langley, Washington, where their city council issued a proclamation that made this statement that the moment you take your table and set it on the sidewalk, that's an indication that you are in contract with the city. You've essentially held them blameless for falls and injuries, and you will provide recompense if there's any sort of maintenance related problems. And so they have gotten around all of the legal requirements that normally went into their permitting process by simply associating that contract with putting the table on the sidewalk. It was really quite a brilliant idea. The city of Atlanta has taken this to the next step with your Broad Street Boardwalk downtown. And this actually takes over the entire street for public use, which is an interesting concept and only can be done very, very strategically in short blocks that have very low traffic demand. But as you can see, it really creates a sense of community. It builds the economy of the local businesses that otherwise couldn't seat and serve this many people. And it's a fabulous idea. I know it's currently under redesign for reconstruction, but y'all are ahead of the curve by taking over the whole street already. The next issue is larger, and you see that in the upper right-hand corner, and anything that happens between the curbs begins to impact traffic capacity and therefore involves traffic engineering and public works. But we have seen it not only in Atlanta, but all over the world. This is a huge global tool that has been used throughout the pandemic, is to enable pop-up bicycle lanes. And one reason it was so critical during the pandemic was because of the loss of public transit for a good while. And this enabled people to continue to commute and to get to wherever they needed to go with active transportation. And one thing that we've discovered through this is that if the facilities are available, people will use them. And as a result, public health will improve, cost to community for healthcare will go down, and it's an overall public benefit. We've known this for a long time, and cities have long been acquiring bicycle master plans and enlarging those. But this has just proven once again to us how important bicycle facilities are. Of course, the biggest missing piece in most bicycle master plans is the connections and making sure that you can actually get where you need to go safely on your bicycle. And the pop-up lanes are a way to incrementally improve that at a tactical urbanism level. And then the extra large, the most challenging option is, your guide refers to it as slow streets. Many places talk about this tool as open streets. And we saw it in the video at the beginning of this section, where you actually close the street to vehicular traffic if it's not local between certain hours and for certain numbers of blocks at a time. And I will just say there are some major issues associated with this that have to be carefully managed. And it's the strategy for how long it's going to last, the coordination with residents to make sure that you have their support, and also the actual management and maintenance of the barriers, because many motorists will move those out of the way. And once one barrier is moved, essentially the open street ceases to exist because it will be moved on a regular basis. So we just have to make sure that when you're implementing these within Atlanta, that you have a local entity that is committed to the maintenance and management of the barriers. This is a fabulous database that was compiled by Mike Leiden of Street Plans in New York City, and it's global. It looks at the status of the open street, whether it's in planning or it's actually active, or it has been completed, the length of it, any route management issues, and then a direct link to the project websites. And since this is a part of the Atlanta Tactical Urbanism Guide, it's a fantastic resource to those within your community that are considering implementing one of these. Because as you look at how other streets have been managed and their lessons learned, then you can plan your strategy accordingly to be the most effective. So there are 4 big lessons that came out of the right-of-way tools. And we have been, like I said before, we have been tracking this globally, and they haven't all been complete successes. So to understand the lessons, I think is really crucial. The first one is that you need to equitably distribute whichever tool you're using throughout the city. We found in many places, and New York City actually tracked this, that they were occurring organically, but mostly within affluent neighborhoods. And to make sure that we have equity, there needs to be an overall strategy for their dispersal. Secondly, if you're doing slow or shared streets, that they need to connect to existing cycling and pedestrian infrastructure. One problem that has been identified is they've been too short and you can't get to them on your feet or on your bicycle. So connections are really critical, and they need to be long enough to be substantive. And then, like I mentioned before, it really needs to be determined whether it's the pop-up bicycle lanes, the parklets, or the open streets. It needs to be determined who is responsible for maintenance and management, because the city can't do that. And these are usually managed locally, and they're only as successful as the entity that is managing them. And then finally, you need to plan for a long-term strategy, because so often it's like, hey, this is a great idea, with no real intent of how long it will, what is its duration? Are your residents and businesses committed to that? And what is the coordination with city transportation department to assure that it doesn't have a negative impact on traffic flows within the city? So the long-term plan is really crucial. And then I just have to say on the back end that we have seen that where these have failed, frequently it's because the residents just become weary with it. And they want their visitors to be able to park in front of their house anytime they want. And local businesses sometimes have complained because over a longer term, they feel like they have a reduced traffic. So all of those things should be a very careful part of your planning before you implement any of these tools. The next section is about how we use our parks and open space and how we can diversify that so it's not just associated with active and passive recreation. They have been lifelines throughout the pandemic and obviously will continue to be, but how can we make them have even greater impact for our cities? The first item almost sounds like it's unrelated, but it's expediting temporary uses, because parks are this wonderful venue that can be used for so many things. We've seen in many places where farmers markets can occur there, food trucks can congregate, there can be pop-up retail pods. So all of these things are temporary uses, and usually there's a very laborious process that has to be dealt with in many cities. And as a result, it's a barrier to entry, especially for the small scale issues like the pop-up retail. And especially this will impact the microeconomy that I was mentioning earlier, because the more barriers there are and the longer it takes to go through the process and the greater the fees, the less likely it is that your smallest increments of retail and economy will be able to access it. So it's about reducing those processes. And we point back to Langley, Washington on this one, because this was a part of their proclamation that included the use of public space by showing up. And once you put up your retail stand or you drive your food truck up, you have essentially entered into an agreement with the city. A larger intervention is one that many cities have been struggling with for a very long time, and that is how to increase availability and access to nature. And there are many ways in which this can be done. Mostly it's through comprehensive planning, where things are allocated, and parks master plans. And one tool that would virtually double the size of many cities' park systems is if they could enter into a partnership with their school board. Because what we have seen in a few cities, like one case is Phoenix, Arizona, where the school board was willing to allow specific schoolyards, playgrounds, and sports fields to be used after hours by the surrounding community. And there's a lot of liability issues that have to be negotiated for that, but that is the ideal scenario, because suddenly every neighborhood school also becomes a neighborhood park. So the big lessons learned regarding parks out of the pandemic is, and we've known this for a long time, but to equitably distribute parks throughout your city so that all residents are within a 10-minute walk. And you see the big 72% at the bottom. It's because when I was studying Atlanta, the Trust for Public Lands has this fantastic park score website. I highly recommend it. And y'all have 72% of your residents are within a 10-minute walk of a public park. And it's just mind-blowing how fantastic that is. And the little infographic at the bottom from the TPL website shows that the national average is 54%. So you're 24% higher than 25% higher than the national average. And that's really impressive. But so you can see on the map, the deep purple areas are those that need to be considered and targeted for parks improvement. And one of the easiest ways to do that is to start looking at schools that are within those areas that could be partnered with. One thing that may not be so effective in Atlanta and in many cities is providing a diversity of size and activities throughout parks and throughout the city. And so often we do really great at the regional structured play parks because they're easier to maintain. We consolidate all our assets. But the most valuable parks frequently, especially in the pandemic, were the small neighborhood parks, because they were places people could relax and could socialize with neighbors and friends in a safe space. And so it's that scale of park that frequently gets lost over time. Historically, we were very good at building those, and that's something we need to focus on again. And then finally, the one thing within Atlanta and that we found at Park Score was that affluent neighborhoods have very good facilities and impoverished neighborhoods have very poor facilities. So there needs to be a better distribution of facilities and types of activity across your park system. The final section is the one that's most closely tied to zoning, and that is the economy, or maybe I should say the microeconomy, because that's what we'll be focusing on. And the reason it belongs in zoning is it is expressly tied to use, which is controlled by zoning. In some places it's enabled, and it's been a fabulous success. And in other places, in most places, it's been extremely restricted by zoning and has been a barrier to economic resilience in many cities through the pandemic. So we begin with the accessory dwelling unit, and you might say, what does that have to do with the pandemic and with the economy? But as a result of the pandemic, many families chose to bring their elders home. And if they had a space that they could do that, then it was an option. If they didn't have space, it was not an option. And accessory dwelling units enable us to care for elders. They enable the college students who, when colleges were closed, to come home and study from home and still have their own autonomy. So ADUs are a central part of family health and well-being through the pandemic. The other thing that often doesn't get mentioned is how critical they were to the microeconomy, because so many people were out of work, and those who couldn't work from home had little means to augment their income other than unemployment. And if one had an ADU that you could rent, then that would be some measure of economic sustainability through the pandemic. And so Atlanta has many residential districts in which ADUs are permitted, but you have had a challenge in seeing them built since they're permitting. So one thing you see here under interventions, what stands in the way of building ADUs? A primary issue is setbacks. If the setbacks are very large in your low density zones, you don't have the space to add the secondary unit. One other thing that you have in the city of Atlanta that DCP has identified is height, because your height restrictions are just slightly too low to allow, like in this image, the secondary unit above a garage. That restricts the locations available to building a unit. So your Atlanta City Design housing section has done a fabulous job at talking about the ways the city needs to increase housing stock for the growth projections, and that it needs to be equally distributed, and it needs to be more economically accessible. ACD Housing identifies a number of options that are being actively discussed by Atlanta stakeholders at this time. And the determination of the right approach for Atlanta is still in process. But one thing that I found what really interesting was this map of the neighborhoods that you are focusing on for loosening up your ADU standards. And if you could incentivize ADUs in this large of a footprint of your city, you would go a long way toward beginning to accommodate some of that growth within your existing infrastructure. One thing about expanding the perimeter of the city limits is that it increases miles of water and sewer, miles of road, and maintenance of road, and extension of services. And all of those things are a fiscal burden to the city. So being able to densify in place with existing infrastructure is the best possible scenario for the city's long-term economic future. I loved this comment from ACD that said 11,500 new units will be created if only 15% of current single-family properties added a second unit. So this isn't moving from single-family zoning to two-family zoning. This is just permitting an ADU within your single-family zones. You have such a large area within your city limits already where you can expand and be contextually appropriate, that you really have tremendous capacity to do this. So now we'll move on to commercial uses and how they could be addressed. The issue of enabling home occupations, most cities don't even need to be told that, and Atlanta permits it. The barrier to it in virtually every place we've worked is the size that's permitted, parking restrictions, number of employees, and if you are permitted to have any sort of signage at all. And so with the pandemic move home, for those who could work from home, we're seeing an entire shift in the way people work. And market analysts are projecting that will move forward into the future. And it's not something that will stay the way it was in lockdown, but there are many large corporations, including all the tech companies, many of the national labs, even a number of just large business corporations that are permitting those who can to stay at home should they choose. This enables them to reduce their office footprint, and it's a win for them and a win for their workers who desire to work from home. All this being said, we have a lot of barriers within our zoning ordinances to make that possible. And if this can be done in a way that is not a negative impact to neighborhoods, then by all means, it's something we should be pursuing. Something that's even more challenging, but has been an issue that arose pre-pandemic during the retail apocalypse, is allowing accessory commercial units. This really people began to consider this as a result of Amazon and how Amazon has decimated small-scale retail in many, many cities worldwide. And so this takes a code amendment to make it possible. But what it suggests is you look at your higher density historic neighborhood fabric and places that historically had a barbershop or a cafe or a newsstand. And those are the primary opportunities for enabling mixed use once again. And as you see in this image, frequently what would happen is a residence would just do an addition in front to create a small shop front for their business. And if we permitted this to occur again, then whether it's in an issue like COVID or just for general economic resilience, it enables the retailer or the small business to offset their lease with their mortgage. So essentially it enables them to bundle the value of their mortgage with their business needs. And it's something with the historic neighborhood fabric of Atlanta. There's so many opportunities for this that it should be considered to be a by right use strategically. So the big lessons learned from pandemic coding. The first one, of course, is to permit ADUs where possible. And we use the phrase where possible because we know politically it can be a challenge. Some neighborhoods feel threatened by it. And so it has to be very strategically implemented, not to blow up the entire process. Secondly, to permit home occupations and reducing home occupation restrictions everywhere. And this really could apply in R1 and R2 as well. Many of our corporate clients are actually still working, the C-level folks are still working part-time from home. And so the idea of having a Zoom room or being able to increase the footprint of your home office size will be an ongoing part of office use within cities in the foreseeable future. As I mentioned before, this is projected to never go back to what it once was. And as a result, we need to be prepared for that. And finally, to permit mixed use where possible. And by that, we mean where appropriate, just because it's a way in which we can really support our local economies. So there's so many lessons that we learned through cities' experimentations on how to survive COVID. And it has expedited good urbanism that many of us have struggled for years to achieve. But we understand now that that multimodal streets, completely active streets, activated parks and open space, and gentle density. And finally, some sort of mixed use. All of these things have been very conducive to the economy and public health throughout the pandemic. And they should be a part of our dialogue as we move forward to life after COVID.
Welcome to the Atlanta Zoning Ordinance Rewrite Idea Lab.
These idea labs is not to offer suggestions per se, but rather we asked Susan to provide an outsider perspective of what was happening in other American cities for consideration in the city of Atlanta. As many of you have noticed in the chat, her video was made earlier this year, so well before the Atlanta City Design Housing material went to the MPUs. And so we are very, very aware of a lot of the concerns and have certainly been following that process. But what we wanted to do was to allow everyone who may have any questions for Susan to ask her for maybe the next 10 to 15 minutes or so. So if you've got any questions, please raise your hand and Director Holmes will call on you.
I certainly will. Thank you, Caleb. In addition to that, anyone who is at any of our viewing parties, please make sure that the facilitators put your questions into the Google Doc so that they also may be answered. Again, facilitators, please make sure questions are entered into the Google Doc so that questions may be answered. So our first question comes from Jim Martin. Mr. Martin?
Yeah, it wasn't clear to me what a lot of that stuff, like the Open Streets Initiative, had to do with zoning. And this is about zoning, right? Mm-hmm. So, I mean, is this something that is somehow now prohibited by zoning and could be permitted, or should be encouraged, or could be encouraged, or the relationship was unclear to me.
No, that's a very good question, and I alluded to it, but I wasn't crystal clear about it in the beginning. That there are general planning issues that were included in the pandemic toolkit that aren't explicit to zoning. Most of the use-based issues were, they followed the streets. And well, uses are associated with streets in the public right-of-way and with park space, but not with what happens between the curbs. So that isn't a zoning issue.
Next question is from Paul McMurray.
Yes, this is why I believe this presentation is very biased. The whole thing was about ADUs as a solution. Like, for instance, if the city raised its occupancy rate from 82% to 85%, just as many units could be made available. And this would have the added benefit of reducing blight in a lot of Southeast and Southwest neighborhoods. So I really don't appreciate the
Mr.
limited
McMurray,
scope.
Mr. McMurray, I'm sorry to cut you off, but do you have a question?
Yeah, my question is, we have very limited perspective, okay, about how we go about creating more density, okay? I don't think ADUs is the right way. As I've said before, I'm live in neighborhoods that have a lot of absentee home ownership. And as a result, when the ADU gets put in there, it makes the investor stronger in the community and challenges the level of home ownership. So I would like to have alternatives, okay, that take the basic, especially in areas where it's in the single family areas that maintain zoning uniformity in those neighborhoods. To me, ADUs are not a way. All right, and we aren't having a full option discussion. Okay, our assumption is, well, we do ADUs, then we try to figure out a way to put MUMR in single family areas. And that's probably where all.
Thank you, Mr. McMurray. Thank you for your comments. Thank you for your comments. We'll move on to our next question. Next question is, what type of street is the best for tactical urbanism? Susan?
Well, that's a really great question, and it's nuanced. Local streets are easy, but they don't necessarily have the length that is beneficial. The one you saw in Queens was a collector, and so the reason it happened so successfully there was because of the reduction in traffic during the pandemic. And so I don't think there's a single answer to it. I think it really you have to assess the situation, particularly, to look at the ones that you're considering.
Next question is from Mary Norwood.
What I wanted to just mention, and it is not a question, I know, but we have commercial corridors in our town that are underutilized, and that was in Atlanta City Design, not Atlanta City Design Housing. We have thousands of acres of vacant land. We have thousands of blighted properties, like Paul McMurray was saying. So we are fiercely protective of our neighborhoods, which we went through last week. So my question to you is there something in tactical urbanism that can, with zoning on these commercial corridors, some of which are clogged and some of which are really not used and have not seen any development in years, can we take that tactical urbanism and do that on our major corridors that spread out from city center throughout our entire city?
Yes, absolutely. It's tactical urbanism is very well utilized in commercial corridors.
Next question is, what is the best way to support existing neighborhood retail before expanding it to residential areas?
It's a good question. I don't know that I have I would be the best one to answer that. It depends once again on location, but supporting local retail is based a lot on patronage of the neighborhood. And if you have a decent marketing strategy, if there are predictable hours that the retail is open, it can become more of a destination. But there's so many things that have to do with numbers of people that make the difference in successful retail. But if you talk to Bob Gibbs, the specialist in urban retail, he would tell you, it's a gift, really. It's about clarity of windows and how clean do you keep your windows and how clean do you keep your door glass and how do you merchandise? And so it's a very complicated question, but it starts with the number of people that are in the surrounding area that can walk or bike to the retailer.
Thank you. What is the best way to protect pedestrians and people with disabilities in shared streets? Scooters and bikes go fast and wheelchairs go about 5 miles per hour.
That's an excellent point, and I didn't mention it in the video, but that was one of the points of conflict that has been documented in the New York City assessments. And it's something that has to be carefully considered when if a community is looking at implementing a shared space. There's also strategies for example, one of my colleagues is in Winnipeg, Manitoba, and they use their frozen rivers in the winter as shared space. And the places that are more contemplative and are for walkers and they are separated on the edge from the areas that are faster for the skiers and the kick sledders and folks like that. So there is a question of separation that should be considered if the street is wide enough.
I don't see any more questions in the Google Doc or any other. Nolan Leak.
I have a question. has anyone started studying the impact of remote work on Atlanta? It's a small area, and it may be that we're seeing the beginning of the end of 150 years of urbanization. And I think before we make any major zoning changes, we need to know what direction that is going. And it may take several years before we know that. Has somebody started that process?
Yetta, do you know the
We
answer?
have not, no, we have not started that process. There's no one that's studying that currently. I'm sure that as time evolves, there may be a department or agency that does study that, but currently we do not have anyone working on that, not in the Department of City Planning. I know that we've only talked about requests that we've received to change some of the office spaces to either residential or some other type of development or some other type of use. But nothing that we've been working on concrete. Robert, do you have something to add to that? Robert Reed?
I do. Yes, one of the things that is unique about Atlanta and has been discovered here recently is we are actually leading the much of the United States in our office development. Ironically, it is an unexpected sort of situation as far as the amount of office absorption and office space that is being built, and it is absorption being a number of people taking up existing office space, and so ironically, Atlanta is actually leading in that, and so the change here may not be as significant.
You're
Thank you,
really
Robert.
fortunate.
Chandra Foster?
Yes, my question goes back to what the gentleman just said with the work from home posture and the possible change of the trend for urbanization. Is there somebody that's doing something comprehensively to look at all of those things? You know, should we head off in a plan in terms of rezoning when, you know, the new trends may make all of this unnecessary? Is there anybody that's looking at a holistic view of all of the various trends that are going on within the city and from an urbanization standpoint?
We don't, the Department of City Planning does not have anyone that is working on that specific issue. The other thing is that we are not rezoning in the sense that we have nothing written or have not seeking to do anything this particular year or month with regard to the zoning rewrite. So as the rewrite evolves over the next 3 to 5 years, all of that information and data will also be evolving right along with the rewrite.
Yeah, and I would like to add to Director Holmes' comments. Part of, we talked about this at the first Idea Lab, but part of this process, in fact, probably about 80% of it is just cleaning up the technical problems with the current code, where the code is unclear, where it's inconsistent, where it's poorly organized. And so even if the city doesn't add a single person, we have seen a lot of data that suggests that buildings do redevelop over a certain amount of time. And so the code does really demand a greater degree of user friendliness, regardless of if there are any map changes or not, or any rezoning or not. Any other questions? Well, great.
Let me check the Google Doc, Caleb. Yeah, no other questions.
Okay, great. Well, good. What I'd like to do now, and again, I want to thank you for your questions. Again, as we've said, Susan is really here as a national perspective, a national resource, but this process is about us, the stakeholders of Atlanta, figuring out which of these ideas really are applicable and should be considered as part of the zoning ordinance rewrite. And obviously, Director Holmes and myself are very aware of everything that's happening with the city regarding the ongoing ADU discussion, regarding the fact that not all of these items are part of zoning, but they are part of thinking about COVID-19. So with that said, I wanted to do a little bit of additional polling to begin to see folks' reactions to this. We're going to start very general and then in fact get more specific. So the first thing I wanted to add or wanted to ask was to see how the pandemic may have affected you as individuals. Yinka, if we could bring up the first question. we're curious in knowing if the pandemic has changed the way in which you use your neighborhood. And again, for folks who may be watching at a viewing party, please go to menti.com, enter code 8291-8920. Again, menti.com, 8291-8920. Okay. Great. So some people, it's about 50-50. Some people it has, some people it hasn't. We'll give the folks at the viewing parties a bit longer to join. We've had so far there, we've had more people say no at the viewing parties than in the Zoom meeting. But yeah, many more. Okay, great. So the next question is, as Susan mentioned, one of the areas where the pandemic has really changed the way we live regards shopping. I'm sure we're all doing different ways of shopping than we did previously. So even though this is not a market study, we're interested in knowing if the way in which you shop has changed since the pandemic. So the next question is, has your shopping changed in any of the following ways? And this is actually a multiple choice, so you can select all. Are you doing more online shopping? Are you doing less shopping in big box stores? Are you doing more shopping at big box stores? Are you shopping closer to home? Are you making fewer trips or combining trips or other? So take a moment to look at these and really consider how your life has changed in the past 18 months as you shop. And I know this one, again, this is a multiple choice, so you can select as many as possible. So a lot more online shopping, very consistent with national trends. Looks like the folks in the survey thus far are very representative. Our Mentimeter folks are also recording very similarly. So again, more online shopping, a lot more supporting small businesses, smaller stores, shopping closer to home, and trying to combine trips. Okay, great. So the next question sort of builds on this a little bit more, because we know that neighborhoods and sort of what people need in their daily life is about more than just shopping. People need childcare, people need banks, people need pharmacies, people need daily goods and services. So we're interested in knowing, from your perspective, in an ideal world, right? In an ideal world, how would you like to access these various types of shopping uses or daily needs? Would you like them to be within a 5-minute walk? That may be an applicable answer if you live in a more urban part of town. Would you like to have them within a 5 to 10-minute walk? So again, not necessarily next door, but close. Or is your preferred way of getting around, getting to daily services, bike riding or driving? And then in the driving, we have 2 subcategories: within 5 to 10 minutes, and then more than 10 minutes. And you may ask why we're defining this, why we're asking this question and a question about zoning. And really the reason is because the city does have many commercial zoning districts today, and quite a bit of their size and their scale really depends on the area that they're serving. So we're very interested in seeing your thoughts here. Okay. Good. So it looks like many folks, about a third of you are interested in things being about a 5 to 10 minute walk away. Some, very few, base it on a biking distance. 5 and 10 minute drive, again, very consistent with that idea of not necessarily having things right next door, but having things in a close distance. The comments on the at the viewing parties, we have a couple within a 5 to 10 minute walk, several folks with no opinion. So again, fairly consistent, but let's give it a couple more seconds for folks to answer. Okay. Now, again, remember your choice here, by the way, because the next question is going to ask you follow up on your choice. Okay, great. And Yinka, if we could go to the next question. So the next question is, we just asked you about the ideal, but are you actually able to access your daily needs in the way you choose? Yes, no, or no opinion? Oh, great. Looks like Atlanta is a very satisfying place to live, and about 3/4 of us are very happy with how we can get the goods and services today. In fact, more. This is great. This is also being backed up by the folks who are taking it online at menti.com. We've got very similar results. Okay, we'll give this a couple more seconds. I know the folks who are taking it in person may take a bit longer. Okay, good. Well, again, no significant changes, very high. And then the final question is in many ways going to be, from our perspective as sort of project managers, most important. So as you know, we have asked Susan to present on national trends because we want to understand if any of the things she's talked about are things that, from your perspective, we should look at as part of the zoning ordinance rewrite. So the following question is asking you, if you think about everything Susan shared, and really the things that can be regulated by zoning, to Mr. Martin's comment before. She presented a lot of ideas, but many of them are outside of the scope of zoning, but some of them are part of zoning. And so of the things that Susan mentioned, outdoor dining standards, home occupation, temporary and pop-up. Ms. Norwood had a great comment about perhaps thinking about pop-up and temporary spaces and how we might apply that to existing commercial areas. Access to parks and open spaces, accessory dwellings, accessory commercial. Of all of these things, and again, you can choose as many of you want, are there any of them that you believe are things that we should look at in the zoning rewrite, that we should reconsider? And in sort of gauging this, we're going to be looking at two things. We're going to be looking at the number of responses, really more than anything. So if you don't think we should look at any of these, don't necessarily fill them out. But we do know how many folks are on the call. We know how many folks are in the meeting, Menti. And so this is really about you telling us what kind of things are most important to look at. And we'll give this a couple more seconds. And there is a question that I think should be answered. The accessory commercial use standard, that was one of the ideas that Susan mentioned about allowing very small neighborhood commercial uses in some neighborhoods. So if you look at certain neighborhoods like Grant Park, you tend to have historic corner stores. Inman Park has several, West End has several. That is really what that provision refers to, about thinking about possibly making those legal again. Many of them are, in fact, illegal. And there's another question about what does explore mean? The purpose of the word explore is that we will use these ideas and we will come back to you with more focus. We're at the point in the process of where we have no specific recommendations. We have no specific objectives that we're trying to achieve. We're really trying to identify the types of conversations that are most important to you. Okay, great. Well, with that said, we will save these and we will go to our next presentation, which is about the issue of sustainability. So joining us this evening is a group of 3 folks who are from South Face. And as many of you know, South Face is a sort of energy and environmental brain trust in the Atlanta region, as well as a person, Houston Harris from TSW. And so we're going to allow them to talk to us all very briefly about issues related to sustainability. We heard at the last Idea Lab that sustainability was very important, that we need to think about things like global warming and climate change and tree preservation and solar orientation. And so now South Face is going to provide a brief overview video of what are some of the things that are happening in this area. So Yinka, if you could play the video and we'll all watch it.
Welcome to the Atlanta Zoning Ordinance Rewrite Idea Lab. This is the Sustainability Idea Lab, and my name is Catherine Gunter. I'm a Senior Project Manager at Southbase.
I'm Houston Harris, and I'm a landscape designer at TSW.
I'm Robert Reed, formerly with Southface, an independent advisor and helping out with the project.
A little bit about Southface. Southface is catalyzing a regenerative economy through responsible resource use, social equity, and a healthy built environment for all. Southface works to ensure the built environment exists in harmony with the natural environment and advances equity, helping communities thrive. Our programs are designed to support resilience, human well-being, and economic potential, all while reducing climate pollution and nurturing a thriving natural world. To create a better tomorrow, we aim our solutions at sectors of the built environment that are most important to realizing a more equitable future. Southbase partners with organizations, businesses, and cities of all sizes to craft visions for their own regenerative future. Our mission also ensures that efficient, healthy housing is attainable and affordable for all. We help nonprofit organizations build capacity while reducing their environmental footprint. We train the green workforce that can both benefit from and enable this future while advancing the thinking around key sustainability issues. We're proud to be part of the TSW team and to be working with the Department of City Planning.
Okay, so the first question we wanted to ask
our role in zoning up
is what part of town do you live? Okay. Great, thank you. Okay, you can. Okay, so we have a good.
Is to bring a sustainability lens, and it would be negligent if we did not consider our region's impact on our generation's greatest environmental challenge. While our development patterns have brought innumerable benefits, they are also energy intensive. That energy is overwhelmingly delivered with fossil fuel, which releases carbon sequestered by the Earth's natural system over 3 billion years. As the slide notes, warming of more than just 1 degree Celsius above today's level will make the Earth warmer than it has been in 1 million years. 1 degree Celsius translates to roughly about 2 degrees Fahrenheit.
The Architecture 2030 Challenge is one way that global architects and scientists are working together to find ways to mitigate the 75% of global greenhouse gases that urban built environments like Atlanta are responsible for each year. This challenge resulted from a 2002 study by Ed Mazzara, and its aim is to move the built environment from a major contributor of greenhouse gases to an inspiration for solutions. Through this, Dr. James Hansen of NASA found that by continuing our current emission levels, the temperature could warm 2 to 3 degrees Celsius this century. This would radically change our natural environment as we now know it.
And at 2 to 3 degrees Celsius, the new sea level would be 80 feet higher than today. While we understand there remains controversy and the paths to solutions are varied, we feel it is important to look at all of our actions and implement solutions where technology exists.
One way that we can work towards a solution in the built environment is through the policies and production of our infrastructure. This way, any additional structures can help our communities slow the current levels of emissions by being produced so that we can slow or avoid the path to warming temperatures. As an example of what warming temperatures could mean for us in Georgia, this is a shoreline impact study done by the University of Arizona. This first slide is the current water level with Savannah at the bottom of the screen. At only 1 meter of sea level rise, large parts of Charleston return to the sea and Savannah becomes oceanfront property. At 6 meters of sea level rise, our coastline is almost unrecognizable and Savannah would become an island.
Buildings are the single largest contributor to global warming, accounting for almost half of total annual U.S. energy consumption and CO2. While much of the energy use in buildings is controlled by building codes, how we arrange our buildings in our community also contributes significantly. So it's imperative that we address the issue in this zoning update. This data is from the Department of Energy Information Administration, and is updated regularly, but these proportions have been true for a while. Though we will show the trend lines momentarily, it is important that we aggressively address the largest portion of this pie. The good news is that good zoning practices help address transportation sector energy use as well. Well-designed, walkable, and transit-supported planning reduces single-occupant vehicle use, which is the most energy-intensive form of travel. As these trend lines indicate, we had some success starting in the 1970s when we had to start paying attention to energy use. This is not a per square foot graph, meaning we have only had incremental increases in energy use despite adding millions of square feet of space. This shows that efficiency works. The bad news is transportation is on a path to pass buildings, and with the advent of cheaper natural gas, much of the manufacturing that departed in the 1980s is returning, though hopefully with more efficient processes. This graph shows electricity consumption only, indicating that buildings are primarily electrical. The good news is electricity generation can easily be offset with renewable energy on site and other decentralized locations. Additionally, electrification of cars increased since this graph.
2016 was a banner year for renewable energy. Initiatives done by the Public Service Commission created entrepreneurial opportunities for solar installation like this one in Upson County. The PSC recognized that solar and wind generation at utility scale are less costly than fossil fuel generation and could help keep energy costs low. Despite progress on the supply side of the energy chart, the greatest opportunity lies on the demand side. The Architecture 2030 Zero Challenge designed a path to net zero carbon by 2030.
The Zero Challenge puts buildings on a path for increased efficiency and renewable energy use starting back in 2010. While buildings have become more and more efficient, we are far from an 80% reduction in fossil fuel use. This is where the Atlanta Zoning Update project can help. The Zero Challenge identifies many areas for the built environment to improve, including those listed here. The highlighted areas are opportunities for the zoning ordinance to enable design teams to meet their energy efficiency targets. These additive technologies are generally driven by the energy code, but we will be working to make sure they are accommodated in the zoning update.
So, who is supportive of the challenge? Mayors recognize that over half of the world's population live in cities, and that percentage is expected to grow by 68% by 2050. So working towards zero carbon and zeros makes sense. The American Institute of Architects reaffirmed its 2030 commitment, launching multiple analysis and transparency tools. Member architects joining the commitment seek to help clients save money by making their energy usage more efficient, create a workplace culture that embodies sustainable design, provide a tool that compares energy usage of a space over time and compare that to similar facilities, and track performance data to see how a firm's impact in the 2030 commitment compares to other firms in their region. Other leading cities and South-based clients have committed and are launching common sense policies for the built environment. Putting the built environment on track with the 2030 Zero Commitment Climate Action Plan would significantly decrease our trajectory of carbon-intensive energy usage.
So what is happening locally? Georgia has a huge untapped resource for solar and is the 10th best in the country for solar potential. A few years back, our South-based president at the time was invited to speak in Germany, where he learned of Energiewende, and I hope I pronounced that correctly. This is Germany's transformation to a low carbon economy. Germany has low solar potential, but still gets 6% of its energy from solar thanks to this commitment.
Locally, companies with low carbon commitments make renewable energy work easily. This is the IKEA distribution center that produces just under 2 million kilowatt hours per year. For reference, the Mercedes-Benz Stadium here in town has an impressive solar panel installation that produces 1.6 million kilowatt hours per year, which is enough to power the stadium for 10 NFL games a year. And this is why a low carbon commitment works. As you can see, renewable energy options are very competitive with all forms of energy generation in terms of cost. In this graph, the cost of energy efficiency is the best way to deliver energy to the grid. These levels of efficiency are important and will come up later in our presentation.
All this has led to a transformation of the energy industry. We have not gotten into natural gas, which, though it is a fossil fuel, has the benefit of lower carbon emissions, but it is serving as a bridge technology, going from 16% in 2009 to 46% in 2019. Notice, however, the doubling of renewables in the same time. Remember, we said we would come back to efficiency. All this transformation in the energy industry is keeping rates low, but notice that bills are higher in Georgia because Georgia homes use more electricity. This leads to our most vulnerable communities having to deal with an energy burden, with residents paying upward of 9% of their income towards energy compared to the national median of 3.1%. This includes Atlanta residents in the top 5 most burdened in the entire country. We're going to step inside the house for a minute, so please excuse the digression from zoning, but this is a core equity issue. Housing affordability must be comprehensive and look at the total cost of housing, not just the cost of construction or rent. Burdening low-income communities with housing that has high energy costs and high water costs, lacks access to affordable housing, affordable transportation options, is remote from services and employment opportunities, and most importantly, does not address individual and community health, is unacceptable. Energy and water utility cost burdens in Atlanta are well above average. Furthermore, studies show that dollars saved on utility costs often stay within communities and help generate economic opportunity for others. Asthma is an epidemic in Atlanta, as well as other major cities, particularly in minority communities. Other negative health impacts are also linked to design and construction practices. The savings in healthcare costs due to healthy building practices can more than offset any additional construction costs.
Can you all remember when Atlanta's air looked like this every sunny day in the summer? In the first State of the Air report done by the American Lung Association, Atlanta was ranked as the 9th most polluted city for ozone. Efforts such as efficiency, improved car emissions, and switching away from coal have made a huge difference. In the 2016 State of the Air report, Atlanta ranked as 52nd for the most ozone polluted city. This is a reminder that we have changed things for the better in the past, and we can do it again. As we help vulnerable communities, we also address another major local sustainability issue, water. We are in a water-constrained region with the majority of Metro Atlanta water being supplied by the smallest watershed comparatively in the nation. It takes massive amounts of water to generate electricity, and while a great amount of it is returned to our water system, it is warmed and has a negative ecosystem impact. Energy efficiency would have a positive impact on our demand for water.
So what does all this look like? You can see all the sustainable design features on Southface's campus pictured here. But can you imagine if the South Face, which is the back of the building where you see their solar panels, had another directly adjacent and taller building next to it? It would block the solar access. This is a zoning issue. Perhaps we could have a solar access law here in Atlanta to help ensure that everyone can add solar panels to their building and utilize them. So we're looking for ideas about how the zoning update can improve any of these sustainability issues and how the update can remove barriers to the solution. We're excited to talk with you today and looking forward to the discussion.
We hope that you enjoyed our Idea Lab, and in the coming months, more Idea Labs like ours will be done in the topics of urban ecology, mobility and access, the impacts of COVID-19, placemaking, and unlocking residual space in our city. For more information on these Idea Labs, please visit the Atlanta Zoning website.
Great. Thank you very much, Houston, Robert, and Catherine. We'd now like to give everyone an opportunity to ask any questions of our South Face and TSW team. Again, many of the things that they've presented are not necessarily directly related to zoning, but obviously, as we think about the zoning ordinance rewrite, it really is important to consider sustainability. So we've got about 15 minutes if anyone has any questions for the presenters.
The first question is from Jonathan Miller.
Good evening. My question is, are there other examples? Because I was concerned that you were talking about design, which is ancillarily related to use, which is zoning, but you did finally come around with an example of don't put tall buildings next to other buildings and block their sun. Are there other examples that you can describe of how the sustainability and energy efficiency design actually connects to zoning, please? Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. I'm going to turn that over to Robert Reed.
Sure. So one of the things that was in that list of things from the Zero Challenge, in addition to not shading for solar access, is shading for windows. And so one of the things that we have to deal with oftentimes in a commercial district are small setbacks and zero setbacks at the street. And so things like allowances for band de soleils to prevent shading on critical facades is something that we would like to consider. Allowing building orientation for the solar orientation, like you see at South Face in particular, and then some of the things that were successfully implemented by Ed Basria, things like microclimate, which, considering the discussion that's going on in the chat around trees, is a critical sort of issue. The benefits of trees and the shading and the prevention of urban heat island effects are critical, and so that would hopefully cool us down, create and stop the negative feedback. Additionally, I know that the requirements around the importance of requirements around the visibility, as was mentioned in the earlier presentation, in retail districts, that sort of balancing of the need for visibility in retail districts with the amount of glazing that is required or is allowed in a zoning and is has benefit for energy use. Those are all things that need to be balanced and are examples of things we're going to be addressing. And we're looking for input. So any other ideas that you have about how sustainable design features can be incorporated in zoning, we're looking for those as many of those as possible.
Great. And if I may just add another great example that I've thought about that I would like to explore with the community is, as many of you know, Atlanta does have open space requirements today, and quite often they result in things that we don't necessarily think of as open space. For example, when you read the definition of open space, it actually counts parking lots, and in my mind that is not really not what we imagine. So part of the concept that we'd like to explore here is perhaps reforming the way we count open space and come up with some higher standards for what open space has to be, so that, again, parking lots and loading docks and all that stuff that really isn't accessible doesn't count. And there may be a way that incentives for things like green roofs and pervious materials, that we can also interlink those as part of the conversation.
Exactly. So a great example of the difficulty of implementing a green roof, and especially in an urban environment like Atlanta, is they're obviously very expensive. But if they can help offset some zoning requirements and by changing some of the language and allowances for that, that would be a great incentive for that sort of thing.
Any other questions? Tate Davis.
Hi, thank you. Excited about hearing solar potential of Georgia. Was wondering, are there currently inhibitory zoning practices that make it more difficult for solar to be implemented? And are there examples we can take from other places or cities that would propel the adoption of solar?
Thank you, Tate. Robert, I don't know if you want to take this or if we want to start with Kieta and maybe the existing zoning regulations. I'll leave it up to you.
The current zoning regulations allow solar panels to be installed in all of the residential districts. There's no prohibition on any of that. We would need to explore the allowances in any of the other commercial or quality of life districts. But right now you can do solar panels in any of the residential districts.
So the thing that we would want to look at in particular, I know that there is extra considerations given in historic districts, and sometimes there's not been any sort of prohibition that I understand or that I've seen in historic districts, but there are some considerations on what is the impact on a historic building. But one of the things that we were talking about specifically in and Kiet is right that there's no sort of limitations, and actually there's some allowances in some of the setback requirements. You're allowed to protrude energy generation devices into some setbacks up to a certain amount currently, and so there is some positive provisions. The thing that Catherine was mentioning at the end of that presentation was the solar access and whether or not a building may be built that would then shade a particular building. And so some of these, in commercial districts where there is very little sort of solar potential other than the roof, it may not be a feasible option. And even residential districts where we have, some fairly high height limitations. But ultimately, that is something that we would like to explore and are looking for ideas on. And there are plenty of cities, mainly European cities, that do have solar access requirements, and there are multiple good ideas there that we're going to be exploring.
James Berg.
I was wondering if there have been studies about what is the nexus point between where density helps air quality versus worsens. For example, less density increases auto emissions by requiring more cars and making transit less viable, but more density also often requires cutting down trees and more crowded streets that can worsen air quality in like specific heat island pockets. Have you like looked at like where the sort of how to balance those two factors?
Robert, it
Hey.
looked like you know James, if you want to take this one.
Yeah. James is a former South Face member and employee, and good to see him. Good, I'm glad he's out and engaged in the Atlanta zoning work. And Caleb, I'll let you sort of maybe speak to this, and Susan's still available a little bit. I remember that some of the initial studies that were done by folks, really the public health folks at Emory, as part of the book Urban Sprawl and Public Health, that really getting densities to just over 5 units to the acre can start to have the positive positive transportation benefits, as well as the positive environmental benefits. And so, that's, to give you an idea, roughly 5 units an acre is somewhere around the neighborhood of what you might see in a neighborhood like Canna Park or one of our more historic neighborhoods. And so that density is commensurate with reduced vehicle miles traveled. And I'll see if anyone else has other input on that.
I do not.
Next question is from Mary Norwood.
Yes, I want to ask about the idea of what we do here, which is huge, ultra high density residential towers, all jammed up together with no airflow. And if we are looking at sustainability and livability and air quality with our southern heat, what can we do in a zoning rewrite that has us not continue to replicate that amount of no air, no airflow, no view, no accommodation for anything but just being squished together with traffic. And as we look at redeveloping our corridors, can this look at the idea of sustainability, as you say, 5 units, that is not a 45 or 50 story multi-family, whether condos or apartments. And we have a glut of those in some parts of our city. So what can we do in the zoning rewrite, looking at sustainability that is appropriate density and taking into account our southern heat?
I'll take that again, if that's all right, Catherine. One of the things we mentioned, of course, was the shading, and the shading, having a shading requirement in particular, can have a huge impact on building energy use. Obviously, we build a lot of glass towers, and the sort of percentage of glazing that is allowed. Obviously, you want to have a minimum amount just because of the appropriateness for urban settings, but having sort of perhaps a maximum amount on particular facades and or unshaded glazing on facades, perhaps is a zoning control we ought to consider. And I think that Caleb's point to what do we do with open space and the ability to sort of expand that definition to include and to require green elements as part of that. Hopefully, there's a fairly major movement towards biophilic design, biology-loving design, and the integration of that into buildings is, and potentially around retrofitting buildings is huge. There's great examples. Someone mentioned Singapore in the chat, and Singapore is a great example of really bringing green into the buildings. And so a lot of those are going to be really builder specific decisions, but ultimately we need to be making sure that the zoning doesn't create any inhibitions to any of that.
Yeah, Robert, I'll just add on to that, something that we'll cover in our next presentation are, ways to incentivize more sustainability elements within the building, similar to what Robert was mentioning about Singapore. But there are ways that through zoning you can regulate or incentivize different things, one of them being solar access laws, making sure that buildings do have access to that sunlight. There are places that also have regulations surrounding making sure that streets and buildings are able to get the necessary airflow and making sure that wind tunnels are not created. So that's something that's of interest. We could add that to our list. Okay.
Any other questions? I think that's it, Caleb.
Great, thank you very much. What we'd like to do now is just, again, to do a little bit of feedback on some of these ideas. Again, many of them are not necessarily applicable to zoning, but are important to consider. The other thing I did want to mention to everyone, I failed to mention this earlier, is that the zoning rewrite has engaged South Face for the duration of the process to make sure that we do think about issues of sustainability in everything that we do. And so even though they are here presenting their sort of sustainability this week and then urban ecology next week, they are one of the team members who is going to be helping us and is going to make sure that everything we do in terms of thinking about potential regulations, how does it impact trees? How does it impact urban ecology? How does it impact sustainability? So I did want to let you know that that perspective is part of the team. So I'd like now to do some very brief polling. And so the first one, Yinka, if you could bring up the first question, it is getting back to this idea of energy bills. And we're just curious, do you feel today that you spend too much of your income on energy? Yes, no, unsure, no opinion or other. And again, for those of you who are at the viewing party, you can go to menti.com, MENTI.com, and enter code 82918920. Okay. We'll give it a few more seconds. Some of the viewing party folks have entered theirs. Well, it looks like among the group today, the majority of folks are not necessarily overly burdened by the cost of energy, but there's still a substantial portion, about a third of folks. So that is a very big potential daily expense to think about. The second question we wanted to ask you was sort of harkening back to the days of air quality. For those of you who have been here a while, do you remember when Atlanta did deal with major issues of air quality and non-attainment issues back in the 90s, shortly after the Olympics? The region really has remarkably improved air quality in my experience since that time. So good. Okay, so good. A lot of folks have memories of those bad days, and we can at least be appreciative for how far things have come. And then the third question is, Catherine mentioned that one of the things that we can look at or consider as part of the zoning rewrite is standards for solar access. And I think this also aligns with what Ms. Norwood mentioned, standards for air accesses, light and air access. So do you think that those kind of issues, solar access, should be something that the zoning ordinance rewrite considers at least? Yes, no, unsure, or maybe? Okay. So a lot of yeses. So this is great. This is definitely something that we'll look at, perhaps create some possible scenarios for where this might or might not apply. And again, if anyone does have any additional comments regarding any of these, feel free to put them in the chats. We're going to download them and we'll have those in the record. Or you can also send an email to atlzoning2@atlantaga.gov. And then the final question, and really, again, we've saved the most important question for last in many ways. You've heard a lot about this idea of sustainability and potential sustainable development practices. Is this something that is really important to you as we look at the zoning ordinance? Do you think we should emphasize exploring these kind of conversations moving forward. Okay. So among the folks taking it at the viewing party, so far everyone there has said yes. It seems like it's also very, very important to the folks who are joining us via Zoom this evening. So with that said, I wanted to thank everyone very much for joining us. I wanted to also remind everyone again that this is going to be a slow, deliberative, participatory process to explore ideas, and that the purpose of these idea labs is, again, to put out food for thought. We're going to be using your comments both through the official polling, through the chats, through the supplemental emails, through the phone calls, to figure out a strategy for putting together a series of exercises at a series of workshops next year after the holidays, where we can really get into a lot more detail on this. It's very clear to me that the folks who are joining us this evening are extremely passionate about things. Your feedback is your feedback in your chats are truly thoughtful, and so we want to make sure that we do know the kind of issues that are important to you. So with that said, if anything comes up that you would like to share, I'd like to remind you that you can call the hotline at 404-546-0116. You can send an email to atlzoning2@atlantaga.gov, or of course, you can go to the project website. We typically have the video, all the presentations posted about a week after, just due to the time it takes to download it and process it. And then finally, before we adjourn, I did want to remind everyone that Idea Lab number 3, not number 6, Idea Lab number 3 will be held next Tuesday, a week from today at 6 p.m. And at this session, Robert and Catherine and Houston are going to really build upon some of the sustainability material they presented this evening and talk about urban ecology. In addition, we'll have John Funny with Grice Consulting Group talking about issues of mobility and transportation. So a lot of what we've seen tonight about traffic, about bike access comments, a couple of other things, those will be discussed at that meeting. And so again, with that said, I would like to thank you very much for your participation, and wish you all a great evening. Thank you.